Mabel Lorne had been called many things in the mountain settlement of Briar Hollow, but no one had ever called her unforgettable until the day Jonah Vey saw the old silver charm at her throat and went pale as snow. To the town, she was only the heavy girl who swept floors at the boarding house, the poor girl with patched sleeves, the quiet girl people pushed past when they wanted coffee, clean sheets, or someone to blame. They laughed at the way the stairs creaked beneath her. They said no decent man would ever look twice at a woman built like her. They told her poverty had made her hungry for any coin she could grab, but hidden inside Mabel's faded dress was a name her dying mother had whispered like a prayer, and hanging around Jonah Vey's neck was a mountain-shaped heirloom that should have been buried with the past. By winter's end, the people who mocked Mabel would stand silent in the church hall while she uncovered a secret so cruel it had stolen an entire life before she was even born. The first insult of that morning came before sunrise, when Mrs. Rowe found Mabel kneeling beside the cold stove in the boarding house kitchen, trying to coax a fire from damp kindling. The wind outside pressed against the windows with a low, tired moan, and frost had made white feathers along the glass. Mabel's knees ached from the hard floor, and her fingers were red from scrubbing pots the night before, but she kept working the little bundle of sticks until a flame finally breathed up between them. Mrs. Rowe stood in the doorway with her arms folded over her narrow chest, watching as if Mabel had done something wrong by taking up space in the room. "Careful you don't sit too close to that fire," she said. "If you faint from the heat, I'll need 2 men just to lift you." Mabel kept her eyes on the flame. She had learned long ago that if she answered every cruel word, she would have no breath left for living. "Yes, ma'am," she said softly. By the time the boarders came down, the kitchen smelled of coffee, fried potatoes, and rough corn cakes. Mabel moved carefully between the stove and table, her patched brown dress brushing the chair legs, her thick dark hair pinned low at the back of her neck. She was 24, though worry had put older shadows under her eyes. Her face was broad and gentle, the kind of face children trusted before adults taught them not to. She served plates without complaint, while the men spoke over her head as if she were part of the furniture. Mr. Fenn, the feed store owner, looked at the extra corn cake on his plate and smirked. "Don't let Mabel carry breakfast too long," he said to the others. "Might disappear before it reaches the table." A few men laughed. One did not. He was sitting in the corner with his hat low, a dark coat hanging heavy over wide shoulders, and a beard trimmed short enough to show the hard line of his jaw. Mabel had noticed him only because everyone else had noticed him first. The room had changed when he walked in, growing quiet, in the nervous way a room grows quiet when a storm reaches the porch. Jonah Vey was known in Briar Hollow the way a wolf track was known in fresh snow. People spoke of him when they thought he could not hear, and most of what they said was wrapped in fear. He lived beyond the timberline in a stone cabin where the trees thinned and the old Vey land rose toward the black cliffs. Some said he had once been rich. Some said he had once been kind. Some said a woman had broken him so badly he had turned into something half ghost and half mountain. He came into town only for flour, salt, lamp oil, and iron nails, and he never stayed longer than he had to. That morning, he watched Mabel without smiling, not with mockery, but with a stillness that made her uneasy. When she reached his table, Mabel set down his plate with both hands. "Coffee, sir?" she asked. Jonah lifted his eyes to her face. They were a pale gray, sharp but tired, like winter sky before a storm. "If it's hot," he said. His voice was low and rough from disuse. Mabel filled his cup. As she leaned forward, the collar of her dress shifted, and the small charm she wore slipped free from beneath the fabric. It was not much to look at, just an old silver piece, shaped like a narrow peak, worn smooth from years of touching. Her mother had tied it around her neck with a cord before she died, and told her never to sell it, no matter how empty the cupboard became. Jonah's hand closed around his coffee cup so tightly, his knuckles went white. The color drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked. The kitchen seemed to lose all sound at once. Even Mr. Fenn stopped chewing. Mabel's fingers flew to the charm, covering it as if Jonah might snatch it from her. "It was my mother's," she said. Jonah stood so fast, the chair scraped hard across the floor. Mrs. Rowe came in from the pantry, startled and ready to scold. "Your mother's name," Jonah said, and there was something in his voice that made Mabel's heart stumble. It was not anger, it was fear. What was her name? Mabel swallowed. She had no reason to tell this stranger anything, but there was a terrible need in his eyes. "Etta," she said. "Etta Lorne." Jonah took one step back, as if the name had struck him in the chest. His hand lifted slowly to his own throat, where a leather cord held an old silver heirloom, nearly the same shape as hers, only larger, with a mountain engraved into it, beneath a tiny crescent moon. Mrs. Rowe looked between them, her curiosity sharpening. "Mabel, quit standing there like a stump. There are plates to clear." But Jonah did not move. "Etta Lorne died?" he asked. Mabel felt the familiar ache open under her ribs. 6 years ago." Jonah's mouth parted, but no sound came. For one strange moment, he looked less like the feared mountain man and more like someone who had reached for a door and found only a wall. Mr. Fenn gave a short laugh, uneasy now. "Best be careful, Jonah. That girl has an eye for lonely men with land. Her kind always does." Mabel's cheeks burned. She lowered her gaze, but Jonah turned his head slowly toward the feed store owner. "Speak about her like that again," he said, very quietly, "and you will carry your teeth home in your hat." No one laughed after that. Mabel should have felt grateful, but she only felt exposed. She hated being defended in a room full of people who would twist it into something ugly before supper. She backed toward the kitchen, clutching her charm so hard, the edge pressed into her palm. Jonah's eyes followed her, full of questions he did not ask in front of the others. An hour later, after the breakfast dishes were washed, and the boarders had gone out into the bitter morning, Mabel found him waiting near the woodpile behind the boarding house. Snow dusted his shoulders. His horse stood beside him, dark and still. "I don't mean you harm," he said before she could speak, "but I knew your mother." Mabel went cold. In all her years, no one in Briar Hollow had ever admitted to knowing Etta Lorne, except as a poor seamstress with bad luck, and a child no one could explain. "How?" she asked. Jonah looked toward the mountain, where the clouds clung low over the pines. "I was supposed to marry her," he said. Mabel stared at him. The words made no sense. Her mother had spoken of hardship, hunger, lost chances, and prayers that went unanswered. But she had never said she was promised to Jonah Vey. She had only described a young man with grey eyes and a silver mountain charm, a man who had loved her before the world grew cruel. In her last week, fever had made Etta drift in and out of memory. She would hold Mabel's hand and whisper, "If you ever see the mountain moon, ask why he never came." Mabel had thought it was the wandering talk of a dying woman. Now the man from that fever dream stood in front of her, older, hardened and shaking beneath his heavy coat. "No," Mabel whispered. "That can't be true. She said you left." Jonah closed his eyes, pain moving across his face like a shadow. "She left me," he said. "Or that's what I was told." The wind slipped between them, carrying wood smoke and the distant sound of men laughing on the street. Mabel suddenly felt too large, too visible, too foolish, standing there with her mouth open and her heart pounding. "Who told you?" she asked. Jonah looked at her again. "My cousin, Clive Vey." At the name, Mabel's stomach tightened. Clive Vey owned the sore office, the mining shares, half the pasture land, and most of the men who pretended to be independent in town. He wore fine suits and smiled like a church window, bright and cold. He had never spoken to Mabel except once, when she dropped a basket of linens near the store, and he told her some people were born to be in the way. "Why would he lie?" she asked. Jonah's laugh was short and empty. "Land," he said. It was always land with Clive. He reached under his coat and took the silver heirloom from his neck. The piece caught the pale morning light. Mabel could see now that her smaller charm fit into a hollow at the center of his, like a missing piece made to return. Her breath caught. Jonah saw it too. His hand trembled once before he closed his fist around it. "Etta and I used to meet by Mercy Creek," he said. "She had no family worth naming, except an aunt who was sick most of the time. I had too much family, and all of them thought they owned my future. Etta was poor, but she had more grace than any woman in this valley. I gave her this charm, and kept its mate. I told her when spring came, I'd take her west and marry her where no one knew our names." Mabel's throat tightened. "She waited for you," she said, "until waiting broke her." Jonah looked as if he had been struck again. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then Mrs. Rowe shouted from inside that Mabel was not paid to stand in snow trading secrets with wild men. Mabel flinched, and the old embarrassment returned, heavy and familiar. Jonah noticed. His eyes hardened, but his voice stayed gentle when he spoke to her. "Do you have anything of Etta's? Letters? A Bible? A box?" Mabel thought of the small trunk beneath her narrow bed, filled with scraps of her mother's life. A ribbon, a cracked comb, 3 recipes, a folded church program, a bundle of letters tied with blue thread, most too faded or water-stained to read. "A few things," she said. Jonah nodded slowly. "Bring them to the old chapel after sundown. If you want answers, we start there." Mabel should have said no. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Why the chapel?" Jonah looked toward town, where Clive Vey's office stood proud at the end of the street. Because church records don't forget as easily as people do. All day, the secret sat inside Mabel like a coal too hot to hold. She cleaned rooms, carried water, beat rugs, and served stew to men who complained because the carrots were too soft. Mrs. Rowe watched her with a narrowed gaze and finally said, "You're walking around dreamy today. Don't tell me that mountain hermit turned your head. A girl in your condition ought to know better than to imagine romance." Mabel folded a sheet with careful hands. "My condition, ma'am," Mrs. Rowe snorted. "Poor, plain, and too big for any man who isn't after something." The words entered Mabel quietly, not because they were new, but because she had heard them so often they knew their way in. Still, something had changed. For the first time, the shame did not settle as deeply. Beneath it was a question. If Jonah had loved Etta despite every rule of class and family, then maybe the story Mabel had been told about women like her was not truth. Maybe it was only a wall, built by people who feared what they could not control. After sundown, Mabel wrapped her mother's trunk in an old blanket and carried it through the back lane toward the chapel. Snow had begun falling in soft, uncertain flakes. Briar Hollow looked almost kind at night, with lamplight glowing in windows and smoke lifting from chimneys, but Mabel knew every shadowed doorway where someone had laughed at her, every porch where women had lowered their voices when she passed. The chapel stood at the edge of town, small and white, its steeple leaning a little from years of wind. Jonah waited beside the side door with a lantern in his hand. He opened the door without a word and led her inside. The chapel smelled of dust, cold wood, and old hymnals. At the front, a faded blue curtain hung behind the pulpit. Mabel had not been there since her mother's funeral. She remembered sitting alone in the second pew, while women dabbed their eyes for show and whispered about who would take in the big orphan girl. Jonah set the lantern on a table in the vestry, where shelves of ledgers lined the wall. "Reverend Pike kept records from before the settlement was even named," he said. "His son lets them sit here because nobody thinks paper can accuse them." Mabel placed the trunk on the table and opened it. The hinges gave a small cry. Jonah stood back, giving her room. That kindness nearly undid her. Most people grabbed at her things as if poverty meant privacy had no value. She untied the bundle of letters with shaking fingers. The top letters were from Etta's cousin in another county. Beneath them were pages Mabel had never managed to read because the handwriting was slanted and the ink had browned with age. Jonah reached for one, then stopped. "May I?" he asked. Mabel nodded. He unfolded the paper and his breath left him in a broken sound. "That's my hand," he whispered. The letter was dated May 1874. Jonah read it aloud slowly. his voice rough around the words. He wrote of building a small cabin near Mercy Creek, of saving money for 2 train tickets, of his fear that Etta would suffer if she stayed under the shadow of his family. He wrote, "I know they look at you and see a poor girl, but I look at you and see my whole life coming toward me." Mabel pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her mother had kept that sentence for 20 years. Jonah lowered the letter, blinking hard. "I sent this," he said. "I sent so many." Mabel reached into the bundle and found another letter, this one in her mother's neat, careful hand. "My dearest Jonah," it began, "I have received nothing in 6 weeks, but I refuse to believe silence is your choice." Jonah made a sound that was almost a groan. "I never got that," he said. They read until the lantern burned low. Letter after letter told the same slow tragedy. Jonah writing with hope, Etta answering with worry, both letters somehow never reaching the other. Some had been opened and resealed. Some had strange marks at the corners. One envelope bore a faint stamp from Clive Vey's freight office, though it should have gone through the post. Mabel felt the room closing around her. Her mother's loneliness, once vague and sad, now had a shape. It had hands. It had a name. Jonah sat down hard in a chair and covered his face. The feared mountain man, the man children dared each other to follow, trembled in the lantern light like an old wound breaking open. Mabel wanted to comfort him, but she did not know how. Her own grief was rising too fast. "She thought you stopped loving her," she said. "She told me love was real once, but it could be taken away without warning." Jonah looked up, and his eyes were wet. "I thought she chose comfort over me," he said. "Clive told me she married a peddler and left the valley." Mabel shook her head. "She never married." The words seemed to echo inside the vestry. Jonah stared at her, and in that silence Mabel understood the question he was afraid to ask. Her mother had never told her who her father was. Not clearly, not with a name. In town, people had used that unknown space as a place to throw dirt. They called Mabel a mistake, a burden, a poor woman's shame. Etta had only said, "You were made from love, even if love was stolen from us." Mabel touched the silver charm at her throat. "I was born in January of 1875, she said. Jonah looked at her as if the floor had opened beneath him. His lips moved, counting months. The answer reached him slowly, then all at once. He stood, but his knees weakened, and he gripped the table. "Mabel," he whispered. She stepped back, frightened by the tenderness in his voice. "No," she said, though she did not know what she was denying. "No, don't say anything yet." Jonah obeyed. That made it worse. If he had pushed, she could have become angry. If he had claimed her, she could have rejected him. Instead, he lowered his head, held his grief like a man holding a candle in wind, and said only, "We need proof before this town hears one word." Mabel nodded, because proof was safer than feeling. They searched the chapel ledgers until midnight. At last, in Reverend Pike's cramped hand, they found an entry from April 1874, noting a private promise of marriage between Jonah Elias Vey and Etta May Lorne, witnessed by the Reverend and one Abigail Trent. Beside it, in different ink, someone had written, "Withdrawn by family notice." Jonah stared at the false note. "I never withdrew anything." Mabel's hands shook as she turned the pages. 2 entries later was a record of a sealed confession taken from Abigail Trent in 1889 and stored at the county office. Mabel knew that name. Abigail Trent had been the town midwife. She had helped deliver Mabel, then died before Mabel was old enough to ask questions. The next morning, Briar Hollow woke under a clean layer of snow, unaware that its old lies had begun to thaw. Mabel worked through breakfast with red eyes and a quiet mouth. The men at the table were too busy arguing about timber prices to notice. Mrs. Rowe noticed everything. "You look worse than usual," she said, while Mabel carried a tray of dishes. "If you've been chasing after Jonah Vey, remember this: men like that do not marry women like you. They use them for pity, then leave them worse than before." Mabel nearly dropped the tray. For years, she would have swallowed that sentence and let it poison her. This time, she looked Mrs. Rowe in the eye. "My mother was more than people said she was," Mabel replied quietly. "So am I." The kitchen went still. Mrs. Rowe's face flushed, but before she could answer, the front door opened, and Clive Vey walked in with snow on his polished boots and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Clive was 50, handsome in the careful way of men who knew money could polish almost anything. His hair was silver at the temples, his coat lined with fine wool, his gloves soft black leather. He looked around the room and took in Mabel, her red eyes, her straightened shoulders, and the small charm no longer hidden beneath her collar. His smile tightened. "Miss Lorne," he said, "I hear you had a long conversation with my cousin yesterday." Mabel felt the room turn toward her. "That is my business, Mr. Vey." A few men muttered at her tone. Clive removed his gloves finger by finger. Young women without position should be careful what business they claim, especially when they begin asking after families above their station. Mrs. Rowe gave Mabel a sharp look that said she had been right all along. Clive stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to keep others from hearing. "Jonah has land. You have none. Jonah has a name. Yours is uncertain. Do not make the mistake of thinking a sad story and a pretty trinket can buy you either." The insult struck deep because it was polished enough to sound respectable. Mabel's face burned, but she did not look away. "Did you come here to warn me or frighten me?" she asked. Clive's eyes cooled. "I came to save you from embarrassment." He glanced over her body with practiced cruelty. "The world has already been unkind enough in making you noticeable for the wrong reasons." A soft laugh moved through the room. Mabel's throat tightened, and for one terrible second, she was a child again, standing outside the schoolhouse, while girls called her names through cupped hands. Then Jonah's voice came from the doorway behind Clive. "You always did dress cowardice in clean words." Clive turned. Jonah stood in the open door, snow in his beard and fury in his eyes. "Cousin," Clive said lightly. "Still haunting the edge of town?" Jonah stepped inside. "Still selling what isn't yours?" The room held its breath. Clive smiled, but a pulse beat fast at his temple. "I own everything with my name on it." Jonah's gaze shifted to Mabel. Not everything. Clive's expression changed, just enough for Mabel to see fear hiding behind pride. Then it vanished. "Careful," he said. "Old men with bitter memories often mistake shadows for enemies." Jonah moved closer, and the board under his boot creaked. "I was 26 when you told me Etta left. I believed you because you were blood. That was my mistake." Clive looked around at the listening faces, then laughed softly. "Etta Lorne? This is about that seamstress." He made the word sound small. "Jonah, you mourned a childish attachment and let it rot your life. Don't drag this poor girl into it because she reminds you of old foolishness." Mabel felt something in her chest go still. Poor girl. That was how they always softened the knife. Jonah opened his mouth, but Mabel spoke first. "My mother was not foolishness." Her voice surprised everyone, including herself. It was not loud, yet it carried. "She was a woman who worked until her hands bled. She raised me with nothing because someone made sure nothing was all she had. If you know anything about that, Mr. Vey, you should pray we do not prove it." Clive stared at her. His smile was gone now. "Listen to yourself," he said. "A boarding-house maid, accusing respected families because some lonely mountain man showed her attention. People will see this for what it is." "Then let them look closely," Mabel said. That was when Clive made his mistake. He leaned near enough for her to smell the peppermint on his breath and whispered, "Girls like you are easy to bury under laughter." Mabel heard the threat beneath the insult. So did Jonah. But Mabel lifted her chin. "Then I suppose I had better learn to stand where everyone can see me." By noon, Jonah and Mabel were on the road to the county office in Marrow Falls, riding in a small wagon borrowed from an old liveryman who owed Etta kindness from years before. The road wound through pine forests heavy with snow. Mabel sat wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the mountains rise and fall beyond the trees. Jonah drove in silence for nearly an hour before he said, "I am sorry." Mabel looked at his profile. For what? His hands tightened on the reins. For not finding her. For believing a lie because it hurt too much to challenge it. Mabel wanted to tell him forgiveness was simple, but it was not. Her mother had died in a rented room with a cough in her chest and unpaid bills on the table. Mabel had grown up eating watered soup while Vey land fed other people's wealth. Yet beside the anger was a sorrow she could not separate from his. Jonah had been robbed too. "She never hated you," Mabel said. "Even when she thought you left, she loved you. That may be the saddest part." Jonah's eyes stayed on the road, but his mouth trembled. "I had a cabin ready," he said. "Small but good. I built a shelf by the window because she liked morning light. I carved a cradle once, though I told myself it was too soon." Mabel turned away, blinking fast. The thought of that empty cradle hurt more than any insult the town had ever thrown at her. "I used to wonder why my life felt like an answer to a question nobody would ask," she said. "At school, other children knew where they came from. I had my mother's name and a room above a laundry. When she died, people looked at me like I was proof of something shameful. I started to believe I was." Jonah pulled the wagon to a stop beside a frozen creek. For a moment, only the horses breathed in the cold. "You were never shame," he said. "Do you hear me? Whatever the papers say, whatever we find, you were never shame." Mabel nodded, but tears slipped down anyway. The county office smelled of ink, dust, and old coal smoke. The clerk, a thin man named Mr. Alden, looked annoyed when Jonah asked for sealed records connected to Abigail Trent. "Those are not for casual reading," he said. Jonah placed 2 coins on the counter. Mr. Alden did not touch them. "Money does not open sealed testimony." Mabel stepped forward. "I am Etta Lorne's daughter. The record concerns my birth and my mother's property." The clerk looked her over in the familiar way, measuring her dress, her size, her patched cuffs, and deciding how little power she had. "Many people believe old records concern them." Mabel swallowed humiliation and kept her voice steady. "Then let the law decide. If you refuse me, write your refusal with your name and the date, so I may show it to a judge." Jonah's eyes flicked toward her, and she saw a spark of pride there. Mr. Alden's expression soured. After a long pause, he turned and disappeared into the back room. He returned with a flat tin box and a warning that nothing could leave the office. Inside was Abigail Trent's sealed statement, witnessed 2 years before her death. Mabel unfolded it with trembling hands. The midwife's words were plain, careful, and devastating. Abigail wrote that Etta Lorne had given birth to a daughter in January 1875, after months of searching for Jonah Vey. She wrote that Etta possessed letters proving a promise of marriage and a claim of joint settlement on a parcel near Mercy Creek, land Jonah had intended to transfer to her before their wedding. She wrote that Clive Vey came to her house 3 nights after the birth, with money and threats, demanding silence. Abigail admitted she had been afraid. Her husband owed debts. Her sons worked for Clive. She had kept quiet, and the guilt had followed her like a second shadow. At the bottom, in fading ink, she wrote, "If Etta's child lives, let her know her mother was loved and wronged, not abandoned." Mabel read that last line 3 times before the words blurred. She pressed the paper to her chest and bent over it, trying not to sob in front of the clerk. Jonah stood beside her, one hand hovering as if he wanted to comfort her but feared she might break. The room seemed too small for the grief moving through it. Her mother had died believing the world had turned Jonah away from her. Jonah had lived alone because he believed Etta had chosen another life. Mabel had carried the weight of other people's lies in her own name, her own body, her own hunger. It was too much. A sound came from her that she could not stop, low and wounded. Jonah gently took her shoulders, and this time she did not step away. "I am here," he said. "I should have been before, but I am here now." Mabel cried harder, because those words were both comfort and a reminder of every year they had lost. They copied the statement by hand, along with land entries tied to Mercy Creek and a property deed filed under a trust name no one in Briar Hollow had ever mentioned to Mabel. The deed showed that a portion of valuable timberland and mineral access had been placed in holding just before Jonah and Etta's letters stopped. A later transfer moved the land into a company controlled by Clive. The clerk grew pale as the papers piled up. "This is complicated," he said. "Complicated is what people call theft when the thief owns a good coat," Jonah replied. Mr. Alden did not argue. Before leaving, Mabel asked if there were more records. The clerk hesitated, then mentioned a box of old freight office papers donated after a fire. Most were damaged, but some survived. Among them, they found delivery logs marked with intercepted letters between Etta Lorne and Jonah Vey, signed by a clerk who had worked for Clive. Mabel stared at the names, the dates, the proof. The past had not vanished. It had been waiting in dust. When they returned to Briar Hollow 2 days later, the town already knew enough to be nervous. Gossip had moved faster than the wagon. Mrs. Rowe met Mabel at the boarding house door with a face tight as a tied sack. "Clive Vey came asking for you," she said. "Said you were spreading ugly claims." Mabel stepped inside, exhausted from travel, but steadier than before. "I need my trunk." Mrs. Rowe blocked the stairs. "I cannot have scandal under my roof. Respectable boarders do not like trouble." Mabel looked at the woman who had paid her little, fed her less, and used her loneliness as a leash. "Respectable boarders laughed while I went hungry," she said. "They can survive my absence." Mrs. Rowe's mouth fell open. Mabel went around her and climbed the stairs. In her small room, the bed was narrow, the ceiling slanted, and the cold came through the wall in thin drafts. She packed everything she owned in less than 10 minutes. It hurt to see how little there was. Jonah waited outside with the wagon. When Mabel came down carrying the trunk and a cloth bundle, Mrs. Rowe followed, hissing, "Where will you go? To his cabin. Do you know what people will say?" Mabel stopped on the porch. Snow drifted around her shoulders. For once, the shame did not answer first. "People have been talking about me since the day I was born," she said. "Let them tire themselves out." Mrs. Rowe's face twisted. "You think a paper will make you better than us?" Mabel looked at the street, at the windows where curtains shifted. "No," she said. "I think truth will make me harder to use." Then she stepped down from the porch. Jonah took her trunk without comment and secured it in the wagon. He did not offer her pity. He offered her his hand. She took it, and half the town watched as Mabel Lorne climbed up beside the mountain man they feared and rode toward the timberline. Jonah's cabin stood in a clearing where the pines opened to a view of the white peaks. It was made of stone and dark timber, strong against weather, lonely against everything else. Inside it was clean but spare. There were 2 rooms, a loft, a wide hearth, and shelves filled with tools, jars, books, and folded maps. Mabel noticed the shelf by the window before Jonah mentioned it. Morning light rested there, pale and soft. A small carved cradle sat in the corner beneath a canvas cloth. Jonah saw her looking and turned away. "I never could burn it," he said. Mabel touched the edge of the cradle. The wood was smooth from careful hands. She imagined Etta sitting by the fire, laughing at Jonah for building too early. She imagined herself sleeping there as a baby, warm, wanted, known. The thought nearly broke her, but it also gave her something she had never had before, a possible beginning that had not been shameful. For several weeks, Mabel stayed at the cabin while she and Jonah prepared their case. Nothing about it was simple. Jonah insisted she take the bed, and he slept near the hearth, rising before dawn to cut wood and check traps. Mabel cooked, copied papers, sorted letters, and slowly became used to silence that did not judge her. At first, she moved through the cabin as if she needed permission to touch anything. Jonah noticed, without making her feel foolish. "This is your house too, if you need it," he said one evening, as snow tapped against the shutters. Mabel looked up from mending his torn sleeve. "You don't know that." "I know enough." She tied off the thread. "People will say I tricked you." Jonah leaned back in his chair, his face lined by firelight. "People said Etta was beneath me. People said I was dangerous. People say many things when truth would cost them money. Mabel smiled faintly. That may be the longest speech I've heard from you. Jonah almost smiled back. Don't grow used to it. Their warmth grew slowly, not like sudden romance, but like frost leaving the ground. Jonah showed Mabel where Mercy Creek ran under ice, where Etta used to stand on a flat stone and talk about seeing the ocean someday. Mabel told Jonah about her mother's voice, her stubborn hope, and the little songs she hummed when sewing late into the night. Sometimes Jonah asked questions that hurt them both. What did Etta like to eat when she was tired? Did she ever speak of the cabin? Did she laugh much? Mabel answered as best she could. One night, Jonah asked if Etta had suffered at the end. Mabel was quiet for a long time. Yes, she said finally, but not every moment. Some days she still found sunlight. Some days she would brush my hair and tell me I was the best thing that ever came from her life. Jonah bowed his head. She was right, he whispered. Mabel looked into the fire and let herself believe, for one fragile moment, that he meant it. Clive did not wait quietly. He sent men to follow them on the road. He sent a lawyer with a letter, claiming Mabel was harassing a respectable family for profit. He spread rumors that Jonah had lost his senses and that Mabel was feeding his grief to steal land. At church, women who had once ignored Mabel now spoke of morality when she passed. Mr. Fenn joked that if Mabel got hold of Vey property, she would need a house with wider doors. The joke reached Jonah through a hired hand, and his face darkened, but Mabel stopped him from going into town. No, she said. That is what Clive wants. If you frighten them, they will make this about your temper. If I shout, they will make it about my bitterness. We use paper. We use witnesses. We make them answer where everyone can hear. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. You have Etta's courage, he said. Mabel shook her head. No, I have my own. I just did not know what to call it. The chance came in early March, when the settlement gathered in the church hall for a property hearing requested by Clive himself. He thought formality would protect him. He thought the town would stand behind wealth as it always had. The hall filled before noon. Farmers, storekeepers, wives, boarders, miners, and elders crowded onto benches, hungry for scandal dressed up as civic duty. Mabel entered with Jonah at her side and a satchel of records in her hands. She wore her best dress, dark blue wool repaired at the cuffs, clean but plain. Her hair was pinned back, and both silver charms hung together at her throat, fitted into one piece for the first time. The sight of it moved through the room like a held breath. Clive stood near the front in a fine grey suit, speaking with the magistrate. When he saw Mabel, he smiled as if she had already lost. "Miss Lorne," he said loudly, "how brave of you to come." Mabel felt every eye land on her body before it reached her face. She heard a whisper from the back, then a muffled laugh. Her palms grew damp. For a moment, she wanted to turn and walk out into the clean, cold air. Jonah leaned slightly toward her. "Breathe," he murmured. "They are smaller than they sound." That almost made her smile. The magistrate, Mr. Bell, called the hearing to order and asked Clive to explain his complaint. Clive stepped forward, with smooth sorrow in his voice. "This matter pains me. My cousin Jonah has long lived apart from society, carrying old disappointments. Recently, Miss Lorne, a young woman of limited means and uncertain background, came into his confidence. Since then, wild claims have surfaced about land transfers made decades ago. I believe she is using family grief for personal gain." He paused, letting the words settle. "I ask this hall to protect an old family from fraud," the room murmured. Mabel sat very still. Jonah's hands closed on the bench, but he stayed silent. Mr. Bell turned to Mabel. "Miss Lorne, do you wish to answer?" She stood. The hall seemed to tilt. She was used to carrying heavy baskets, heavy water, heavy shame. But this was a different weight. She opened the satchel and placed the first bundle of letters on the table. "My answer begins with my mother," she said. Her voice shook, so she slowed down. Her name was Etta May Lorne. Many of you remember her as a seamstress. Some of you remember her as poor. Some of you remember speaking about her in ways she was too tired to answer. Today, you will remember that she was a person. The room went quiet. Clive gave a soft, pitying sigh, but Mabel did not look at him. These are letters between my mother and Jonah Vey, written before I was born. They prove a promise of marriage. They also prove the letters stopped reaching each other while still being sent. Mr. Bell adjusted his spectacles and began reading. The silence deepened as the letters passed through his hands. Mabel watched faces change slowly. Curiosity became discomfort. Discomfort became fear. She produced the chapel ledger, showing the promise of marriage and the false withdrawal note. She produced Abigail Trent's statement, and when Mr. Bell read aloud the line that said, "Etta's child should know her mother was loved and wronged," a woman in the second row began to cry. Mabel did not soften. Tears were not always repentance. Sometimes they were only surprise at being unable to look away. Clive remained still, but his jaw tightened. "Old papers," he said. "Old grief. None of this proves I did anything improper." Mabel reached into the satchel and removed the freight logs. "These show letters between Etta Lorne and Jonah Vey, passing through your office after you claimed both had abandoned the other." Clive's smile flickered. "Clerks handled freight. That is why I asked one to come," Mabel said. The doors opened, and an old man entered with a cane in one hand and his hat in the other. His name was Silas Creed, and he had worked for Clive's freight office 30 years before. Jonah had found him living with his daughter 2 valleys away. Silas moved slowly to the front, his face grey with age and guilt. He swore his oath in a trembling voice. Then he told the hall that Clive had ordered certain letters held, opened, copied, and destroyed. He said Clive feared Jonah would give Etta legal claim to Mercy Creek land through marriage. He said several men knew. One had been a banker, one had been a church elder, one had been the old magistrate. "Why speak now?" Mr. Bell asked. Silas looked at Mabel. "Because I saw her mother beg at the freight office once," he said. "She was carrying a baby. I told her there was no letter. I have heard that baby's crying in my sleep for 24 years. Mabel's knees nearly gave out, but she remained standing. Clive's face had gone white beneath its polish. "Still," he fought. "A dying man's guilt is not proof," he said sharply. "And even if some letters were mishandled, Miss Lorne has no standing. She is illegitimate. She is poor. She has been coached. Look at her. Does she look like a woman bringing justice, or a woman who finally smelled money close enough to chase?" The words hit the hall with ugly force. Some people looked down. Others watched Mabel, waiting for her to break. Jonah stood halfway, rage rising in him, but Mabel lifted one hand. He stopped. She turned to Clive, and the fear inside her became strangely calm. "You have used my mother's poverty, my birth, and my body as places to hide your crime," she said. "You thought people would laugh at me before they listened. You thought if you made me small enough in their eyes, the truth would sound too large coming from my mouth." Clive opened his mouth, but Mabel kept speaking. "I will not trade insult for insult. I will not call you names. I will not ask Jonah to frighten you. That would be easier, and you would deserve more anger than I have words for. But my mother died, believing love had left her. Jonah lived alone, believing love had betrayed him. I grew up hungry for answers in a town that fed itself on whispers. You did that, and every person who knew enough to stay silent helped you." Her voice broke on the last words, but she did not stop. "You called me a fortune hunter. Fine. I am hunting what was stolen. Not only land, not only money, a name, a truth, a place to stand without apology." The hall was silent now, the kind of silence that has weight. Mr. Bell looked from the papers to Clive. "Mr. Vey," he said, "I advise you to sit down." The hearing did not end with shouting. That almost disappointed the people who came hoping for spectacle. It ended with signatures, orders, and faces turned away in shame. The disputed land was frozen pending formal review. Clive's accounts were ordered open. The church ledger was placed under county protection. Silas Creed's statement was recorded. 2 older townsmen quietly left the hall before they could be named, which told everyone enough. Clive stood stiffly while his lawyer whispered to him, but the fine grey suit no longer made him seem powerful. It made him seem trapped inside the life he had built from other people's pain. As Mabel gathered her papers, Mrs. Rowe approached. Her eyes were wet. "Mabel," she said, "I had no idea." Mabel looked at her for a long moment. She thought of every joke, every cold plate, every time kindness had been withheld because withholding was easy. "No," Mabel said softly. "You had enough of an idea to be kinder." Mrs. Rowe lowered her eyes. Outside, the snow had stopped, and weak sunlight touched the church steps. Jonah stood beside Mabel without speaking. People filed past them, some staring, some ashamed, some curious in a new way that was almost worse than mockery. Mr. Fenn removed his hat as he passed, but Mabel did not thank him. She was tired of rewarding crumbs. At the bottom of the steps, Clive turned back. For the first time, hatred showed plainly on his face. "You think this makes you one of them," he said. "You will always be Etta Lorne's heavy, fatherless girl." A few people gasped. Jonah moved, but again Mabel stopped him. She walked down 2 steps until she stood above Clive. Not by much, but enough. "No," she said. "I am Etta Lorne's daughter. I am Jonah Vey's daughter, if the law confirms what the truth already knows. And I am Mabel Lorne, whether either name pleases you or not." Clive had no answer that would not make him smaller, so he turned and walked away. The months that followed were hard, but not empty. The law moved slowly, as law often does when money has taught it to limp. Clive's transfers were challenged. The Mercy Creek Trust was restored in part to Etta's estate, then to Mabel as her surviving child. Some land remained tangled in courts, but enough returned to change everything. Jonah took a blood test of the old kind, available then only through sworn records, dates, witness statements, and resemblance in the eyes of those who had known him young. The county declared what Mabel had already felt growing quietly inside her. Jonah was recognized as her father in all but the years he had been denied. The first time he signed a paper as Jonah Vey, father of Mabel Lorne, his hand shook so badly, the clerk had to offer him another pen. Mabel laughed through tears, and Jonah looked embarrassed, which somehow made him seem younger. They did not become a family all at once. Real life was not that tidy. Mabel still woke some mornings with shame sitting on her chest before memory could push it off. Jonah still went quiet for hours, when grief for Etta caught him unaware. Sometimes Mabel felt anger at him for years he could not return, then guilt for feeling it. Sometimes Jonah looked at her with such sorrow that she had to remind him she was not a ghost of the woman he lost. "I am not only proof of what happened," she told him one evening by Mercy Creek. "I am here now." Jonah nodded, eyes wet. "I know," he said. "I am learning to love the living without asking the dead to forgive me first." Mabel took his hand. It was rough, warm, and uncertain. That was enough for that day. By autumn, Mabel made her choice. She could have sold the land. Men from 2 counties came with offers, some fair, some insulting. All of them surprised when she read every line before answering. She could have left Briar Hollow and bought a house where no one knew her old humiliations. For a while, the thought tempted her. She imagined a town where she could walk into a shop and be only a customer, not a memory people had already stained. But each time she considered leaving, she thought of her mother, of the boarding house kitchen, of girls standing outside schoolhouses with nowhere safe to put their sadness. So Mabel took the old Vey house near Mercy Creek, repaired its roof, widened its pantry, cleaned its windows, and opened its doors to women and children who had been told they were burdens. Widows came first. Then a girl dismissed from service after a false accusation. Then 2 children whose father drank away the rent. Then a seamstress with a baby and no family willing to claim her. The town did not know what to call the place at first. Some called it Charity with a sour mouth. Some called it Trouble. Mabel called it Etta House. She hung her mother's name over the door in simple carved letters, and Jonah mounted the sign himself, with hands that paused twice before finishing. Inside, the room smelled of bread, soap, wood shavings, and lavender when they could afford it. No one was mocked for taking second helpings. No child was told their birth made them lesser. No woman was required to trade dignity for shelter. Mabel kept strict rules, but they were fair ones. Everyone who could work did work. Everyone who could learn was taught. There were lessons in reading, sewing, accounts, cooking, and the harder art of walking into a room without asking silently for permission to exist. When donations came with pity attached, Mabel returned them. "We accept help," she told one offended merchant, "not ownership." Jonah changed too. At first, he came to Etta House only to repair fences, carry flour, or split wood. The children watched him from corners, whispering about the mountain man. He pretended not to notice. One little boy named Caleb began following him around, with a hammer too heavy for his hand. Jonah told him to keep back. Caleb did not. After 3 days, Jonah made him a smaller hammer from an old handle and taught him how to tap nails straight. That was how the feared man beyond the timberline became the quiet figure children ran to when a sled broke or a shelf needed fixing. Mabel watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as Jonah knelt in snow to show a little girl how to read animal tracks. His face, once carved by loneliness, had softened into something still weathered but alive. When he looked up and saw Mabel watching, he raised one hand, she raised hers back. Briar Hollow learned slowly, and some never learned at all. Mrs. Rowe came once with a basket of linens and an apology folded badly inside her mouth. Mabel accepted the linens and listened to the apology, but she did not pretend old cruelty had vanished, because regret had arrived late. Mr. Fenn tried to make a joke at the market and found no one willing to laugh. That was a kind of justice too. Clive Vey lost much of his standing after the records became public. He was not dragged through the streets, not ruined in the dramatic way people tell around fires, but doors closed to him that had once opened quickly. Men who had followed his money began protecting their own names. He left Briar Hollow before the second winter, selling what he could and taking his polished shoes to a city where fewer people knew how poorly they fit his soul. Mabel did not attend his departure. She was teaching a girl to read a recipe when the stagecoach left. The day Etta House opened its largest room as a school, the whole valley seemed washed clean by spring rain. Sunlight poured through the windows Jonah had repaired. Fresh bread cooled on the sideboard. Wildflowers stood in jars along the sill. Mabel wore a green dress she had sewn herself, not because it hid her size, but because she loved the color. Her hair was pinned back as always, though a few curls escaped around her face. She looked at the room full of women, children, neighbors, and a few townspeople who had come out of curiosity and stayed out of respect. For a moment, she saw the boarding house kitchen again, the laughter, the lowered eyes, the old belief that she was too much in every wrong way and not enough in any way that mattered. Then she felt the silver mountain charm resting against her chest, whole now, with Jonah's piece fitted around her mother's. She touched it once and began to speak. "My mother died before she could see this," Mabel said. Her voice was steady, though emotion warmed every word. "For many years, I thought survival meant staying quiet enough that people would not notice how badly they had hurt me. I thought dignity was something others handed down if you were pretty enough, rich enough, small enough, or born into the right house. I was wrong. Dignity is not a gift from people who approve of you. It is something you carry, even when no one has the decency to recognize it." The room stayed still. Jonah stood near the back, his hat in his hands, his eyes shining. Mabel continued, "This house is for those who have been overlooked, laughed at, doubted, or pushed aside. It is for women who need a door that opens without a question meant to shame them. It is for children who deserve to know they were not born as mistakes. It is named for Etta Lorne because she was loved and because the truth came home through her." When she finished, no one moved for a heartbeat. Then one child began clapping. small hands striking uncertainly. Others joined. Soon the room filled with applause. Not grand, not polished, but real. Mabel looked toward Jonah, and he pressed one hand over his heart. She knew then that revenge did not always look like fire. Sometimes it looked like a table long enough for everyone hungry to sit. Sometimes it looked like records pulled from dust and read aloud until lies lost their shelter. Sometimes it looked like a woman the town had mocked, standing in a sunlit room, no thinner, no richer in the ways they once measured worth, but impossible to dismiss. Years later, people would tell the story differently, depending on what lesson they needed. Some would say Mabel Lorne uncovered a land theft and reclaimed what belonged to her mother. Some would say Jonah Vey came down from the mountain and found the daughter he never knew he had. Some would whisper that Clive Vey was undone by a woman he had mistaken for easy prey. All of that was true, but none of it was the whole truth. The real story lived in smaller moments. It lived in Mabel teaching a frightened widow to sign her own name. It lived in Jonah placing flowers on Etta's grave every Sunday until the path there stayed clear. It lived in children growing up at Etta House without learning to lower their eyes when respectable people entered the room. It lived in the way Mabel walked through Briar Hollow after that, broad shoulders back, soft face lifted, no longer shrinking from the sound of her own footsteps. On the first anniversary of Etta House, Mabel and Jonah walked to Mercy Creek together. The snowmelt had made the water bright and quick over the stones. The flat rock where Etta once stood was slick with spring light. Jonah carried a small wooden box. Inside was the last letter Etta had written, the one Mabel had found hidden in the lining of her mother's trunk after the hearing. They had read it many times, but that day Jonah asked Mabel to read it aloud by the creek. Her voice shook at first, then steadied. Etta wrote that if Jonah had truly chosen another life, she would try to forgive him. She wrote that their child kicked whenever she sang near water. She wrote that love, if it had been real, could not be made foolish by suffering. And at the end she wrote, "If my daughter ever finds you, Jonah, tell her I wanted her. Tell her she was the bravest thing I ever carried." Mabel folded the letter with care. Jonah was crying openly now, not with the broken shock of the first night in the chapel, but with grief that had learned how to breathe. Mabel took his hand. "She knows," she said. Jonah looked at her. "How can you be sure?" Mabel smiled through her own tears. "Because I know." The creek ran between stones, carrying winter away piece by piece. Above them, the mountains stood as they always had, silent witnesses to love, greed, loss, and return. Mabel touched the silver charm at her throat and thought of the girl she had been, hungry for belonging in a town that mistook cruelty for judgment. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming. Not that pain would vanish, not that everyone would be kind, but that one day, the very things people used to insult her would become part of the strength they could no longer deny. As evening settled over Mercy Creek, Jonah and Mabel walked home toward the warm windows of Etta House. Smoke curled from the chimney. Children's voices rose and fell inside. Someone had burned the biscuits a little, and someone else was laughing about it. The sound reached Mabel across the yard, ordinary and precious. Jonah opened the door for her, and golden lamplight spilled over the porch. For most of her life, Mabel had believed a home was something other people had, something she cleaned, served, or passed by on cold nights. Now the doorway was hers, not because a man had saved her, not because money had changed her, not because the town had finally decided she was worthy. It was hers because she had taken the truth in both hands and refused to set it down, no matter how heavy it became. Mabel Lorne had once been the woman people overlooked, the woman they measured with cruel eyes and small minds. But the mountains had kept their secrets only for a season. The letters had spoken. The records had remembered. The dead had been given back their names, and the living had been given a chance to become something more than what hurt had made them. In the end, Mabel did not burn Briar Hollow down. She did not need to. She built something brighter at its edge, a house full of bread, books, work, laughter, and second chances. And every time a rejected woman crossed that threshold with fear in her eyes, Mabel met her at the door with a warm hand and a steady voice. "Come in," she would say. "You are not too much here. You are not too late. You are not alone." And from that day forward, no one in the valley could speak the name Mabel Lorne without remembering that the woman they once dismissed had become the strongest shelter the mountains had ever known.